October 25th, 2022 Planning Commission regular meeting. Our chair, Roberta Fox, is excused today, so as vice chair, I will be chairing today's meeting. We have one item coming out of the committees this morning and 10 other discussion items today. I would ask the commissioners to hold all questions until the conclusion of all presentations and any public comments so that we can move through the agenda efficiently. Moving on to the public comment portion, we start every meeting with an opportunity for the public to comment on an item not contained on the agenda. Are there any members of the public who would like to speak on an item not contained on the agenda today? Okay. Well then, before moving on to the committee reports, I'd like to note that case Z2422 at East Whitaker Mill Road and Ironworks Drive is being deferred to our next Planning Commission regular meeting on November 8th. So if you are here for that meeting today, you can return on November 8th to hear the case at that time. So then, moving on to committee reports. We have one item coming out of the Text Change Committee today from our October 18th meeting. And with that, I will hand it over to our committee chair, Dean Rains, for an update.
Thank you. I'll keep it brief. There's an omnibus list that the staff prepared. Text Change TC 322 captures a number of things for formatting, text corrections, and some improvements overall. There's two meetings we had on September 20th and October 19th. After that meeting, we issued some minor clarifications. Staff has provided those for today. And on October 19th, the Text Change Committee voted 4-0 to recommend approval.
Thank you. Is there any further questions or comments, discussion at the table? All right. Well, then with that, I'd like to entertain a motion. Commissioner Dottell.
Thanks, Chair Fox. For, let's see, what is it? TC 322, I move to adopt the proposed consistency statement dated October 25th, 2022, containing the agenda materials and to recommend approval of the zoning text amendment. The action taken is reasonable and in the public interest because it will correct multiple errors in the UDO to improve its usability and advance established policy goals.
Thank you. Is there a second? Commissioner Rains? There's a motion and a second. All those in favor, raise your hand. Those opposed? The motion passes 6-0. Moving on to old business, there are 3 items listed under old business today. 2 of these items have been previously discussed, and we have received presentations and heard from the public. So for those 2 items, we will begin with a short update from staff focusing on the revisions to the request. The first item is rezoning case Z5121 at Atlantic Avenue, located at the intersection of Atlantic Avenue and East Whitaker Mill Road. This is a case to change approximately 6.77 acres from industrial mixed use, 3 stories parking limited, to commercial mixed use, 20 stories conditional use. This item was first discussed during the Planning Commission's August 30th meeting, and during that meeting, the applicant requested a deferral of this case in order to prepare zoning conditions to address the commissioner's concerns regarding frontage, the pedestrian realm, and the condition of affordable housing. Revised conditions were submitted on October 13th. I'd like to ask staff for a brief update outlining the revisions to the case.
Thank you, Vice Chair Miller. Good morning, members of the Planning Commission. Those revised conditions were received properly on October 13th. One note I wanted to make, your deadline is October 29th, so beyond today, further consideration of this case would require a request for extension. The zoning, as you see, is predominantly IX and CX. Aerial views of the location here at 2114 Atlantic Avenue. Closer view, note East End Market and Raleigh Ironworks. Fairfield is the closest residential subdivision. This is one of the prototypical post-World War II suburbs built in this area. And just some streetscape views. Note the grade differential in the lower right photograph of Atlantic Avenue as it goes over the rail line, and some other views of ironworks in the residential neighborhood, and again, Atlantic Avenue on the lower right. These conditions have not changed since your previous review. I would like to focus on these new conditions that were submitted on October 13th. Note that these conditions will only apply to development qualifying as a Tier 3 site plan. First of all, drive-throughs will not be allowed for any building within 100 feet of Atlantic Avenue's right-of-way. Pedestrian access is provided for with a sidewalk connecting the East Whitaker Mill right-of-way to the main entrance, nearest main entrance of the building. If there's a building on the site that allows for public access, and that sidewalk shall be a minimum width of at least 8 feet, which does exceed the standard. This condition represents kind of a hybrid frontage, if you will, between parking limited and urban, in that it does provide some streetscape area, public realm area along the Atlantic Avenue right-of-way. There is some parking allowed here, but only 15% of that area would be dedicated to parking. And again, it is an impactful proposal, as you can see, with the changes in density and square footage and a number of units. It scores well in our transportation and energy analysis. Bus service is available. Route 2 is about a quarter-mile away as it currently stands, and Route 1, Capitol Boulevard, about a half a mile away. This proposal does not include subsidized units. It is more or less within walking distance of transit, as noted. The area does have a lower percentage of minority and low-income populations, as seen here, and higher percentages in the over 64 and under age 5 groups. The rate of increase in the median gross rent is a little bit lower than the city average, and no restricted covenants or historical covenants that restricted racial groups were found here. Again, the deadline for action is October 29th, and further consideration would require a request for extension. Staff would suggest an extension of 90 days if this is the decision of the Planning Commission to request an extension. And that does, I'm sorry, I got ahead of myself here. Let me go through the conditions and how they impacted the policies. Number of consistent key policies, as you saw in the last presentation here, and note the APCB2 transitioning to transit. That, as a result of the new conditions, this one is now in the consistent column, as are these urban design policies, which previously were noted as inconsistent. The revised conditions have satisfactorily addressed those inconsistencies, and we have struck those from the inconsistent list. Note, the conditions did not address the housing policies that were inconsistent here. And I also wanted to note that the proposal, as a result of the conditions, is now consistent with urban form. That does conclude my presentation. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. We have heard from the applicant and staff presentations on this item previously, and we've also heard from the public. So I want to open it up to see if there are any commissioners who have any additional questions or comments. Commissioner Nautel.
I just have one clarification question maybe for staff. Can you describe what improvements to Atlantic or Whitaker would be required as a part of like a Tier 3 site plan improvement? Would the addition of sidewalks and behind curb bike lanes be?
Yeah, it's quite an extensive list. I apologize, I didn't bring that up front with me. But it is, obviously the most major one. And I think that I'll defer to the applicant here, but I believe the reason it was specified for Tier 3, in case there are any more modest construction or improvements, it wouldn't automatically trigger those conditions if it was a Tier 1 or Tier 2.
Yes, sir. So any Tier 3 site plan would trigger sidewalks along Atlantic Avenue as well as the above-the-curb bike lane pursuant to TC 3. Yeah, similar to kind of what happened at Ironworks just north of here as well. So we would be doing that as well. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments from the commissioners? Okay. Well, with that, I'd like to entertain a motion.
For Z5121, I move to recommend adoption of the proposed consistency statement dated October 25th, 2022, contained in the agenda materials, and to recommend approval of the zoning amendment. The proposal would provide for more opportunities for housing that is in a place for frequent transit, near future transit station, and provides for employment and commercial amenities.
Thank you. We have a motion for approval. Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. All those in favor, raise your hand. Those opposed? The motion passes 6-0. Okay, moving on. Next is item D2, case Z5522, Johnson Street, on the south side of Johnson Street between St. Mary's Street and Boylan Avenue. This case is to change approximately 2 acres from NX3 Urban Limited to NX5 NX5 Urban Limited to CX12 Urban Limited with conditions. This item was first discussed by the Planning Commission during our October 11th meeting, and since that time, the applicant has made changes, 3 changes to the conditions. Pursuant to our last meeting, Commissioner Rains is excused from this case. I will ask for a brief update to outline revisions to this case.
Real quick, excuse me, sorry.
Yes.
We just need to state, we neglected to do it last time. We just
Oh, we
need to
did.
state the reason for him being recused. If you would, just that you're advising.
Yeah, I'd like to be recused because my company provides professional services for this project.
Thank you. Do we need to vote on that?
It's best, or you can just say that he's recused without objection.
Those in favor of, without objection, we will recuse Commissioner Rains from this case. Thank you. Okay. Gotcha. Or exude his authority from sitting there silently.
I didn't get too far into it.
Great. And with that, I will ask staff for a brief update to outline the revisions to this case.
Yep. Good morning. Thank you. Ira Mabel, Planning and Development. Deadline is in December. So just a reminder, this is the entirety of the south side of Johnson Street between St. Mary's and Boylan Avenue there. So these conditions were present last time and are still there. Use prohibition, building height cap, materials, some planting strip on St. Mary's, parking space minimum, which there would not be otherwise, a crosswalk across St. Mary's Street. And so 7 and 8 are the new ones here. 1 is the requirement of 2 dog waste stations on the property. And the second one, number 8 there, is requiring a bicycle travel lane in Johnson Street. That was a recommendation from the transportation staff who reviewed this case. And there were some other minor technical corrections that I had suggested for clarity of the conditions, which were also made. And then this was also there last time, this condition, restrictions on bar, nightclub, tavern, lounge uses. So consistent with the comprehensive plan overall and with the urban form map, is inconsistent with the future land use map, which I don't have a map here, but so that red today is higher scale. So staff is recommending that you also change the future land use map to community mixed use from higher scale residential. And so that is my update. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. We've heard from the applicant and we've received staff presentations on this item previously, and we have also heard from the public. We've also received the additional emails from the public since our last meeting. So I will open it up to see if there are any commissioners that have any questions or comments updating these, based on these updates or otherwise. No other concerns? Seeing no comment, I would like to entertain a motion. I guess well, if someone else wants to, go for it. I know that I had requested some of those changes to the last meeting that have been provided in these conditions, so thank you for that.
I'd be happy to make a motion since at the end of the last meeting, I pointed out a number of reasons why I would be in favor of this. They have come back and made some additional changes. So I will be happy to move to recommend adoption of the proposed consistency statement dated October 25th, 2022, contained in the agenda materials, and to recommend approval of the zoning amendment. Let's see. After considering the policies, maps, and other materials included as part of the comprehensive plan, the Planning Commission, or I, determined that the proposed zoning amendment is consistent with the comprehensive plan, and although inconsistent with the future land use map, should be approved. The action taken is reasonable in the public interest because of a number of consistent policies, including LU 4.7, capitalizing on transit access, LU 5.4, density transitions, LU 7.6, pedestrian-friendly development, LU 10.3, ancillary retail uses. So that's my motion.
Thank you. I have a motion. Is there a second?
Second.
There's a
Wait, I
motion.
also need
Yes.
to
And amend the flume.
recommend amendment to the future land use map to the extent described in the adopted consistency statement. Did I catch that, David?
Thank you. Is there a second for that full motion? There's a motion and a second. All those in favor, raise your hand. Those opposed? The motion passes 5-0. Thank you. The next item on the agenda is item D3, case Z6222, 9 at Crosslink Road. This request is to rezone approximately 10.10 acres from R6 with zoning conditions and R10 to R6 with zoning conditions. This item appeared on the agenda at our last meeting, but we did not have time to hear it. So I would like to ask, so we will essentially be treating this as new business. I would like to ask staff for a presentation on this item.
Morning, morning, Commission. Just want to note one typo on this slide. The current zoning is R6 CU and R10. Kind of reverse the CU on those two districts, but the deadline for action is December 10th. Current zoning in the area is predominantly residential. This is in southeast Raleigh, outside the Beltline, so generally residential subdivisions and larger lot residential parcels are located in this area. Here's the aerial of the site. So Biltmore Hills Park is to the north, and low-scale residential is surrounding the site. There is a small amount of industrial a little bit further to the northwest. A couple of views of the site, just showing that narrow frontage along Crosslink Road. These are the existing conditions in that R6 district. I just wanted to show that these generally limit residential units, specify architectural characteristics, and limit height for buildings on the site. And then there are some other conditions included here that would generally don't include with the UDO. The UDO sort of takes care of some of these things, so just wanted to note the existing conditions. Proposed conditions, there's one proposed condition which would connect the internal pedestrian network of the development to a required greenway easement on the west side of the property. The request would increase the number of housing units that could be built on the site, and the site is also within a frequent transit area, so just noting with affordable units, there could be a significant increase in entitlement or residential units on the site. The site has a lower walk score than average, higher bike score than the city average. It's similar transit score to the city average, slightly higher, and then average transportation costs and job proximity. The site has 2 bus lines that have stops within walking distance. Route 5 provides 30-minute all-day service, and Route 7L provides 60-minute service. The request would add to the housing supply, does not include subsidized units, permits a variety of housing types, allows smaller units and smaller lots than the citywide average, and is within walking distance of transit. The site census tract includes a higher percentage of people of color. Housing costs in the site census tract have increased slightly faster than the city average, and there's a lower life expectancy in the site census tract than the city average. The requested R6 CU district is consistent with the low-scale residential designation on the future land use map. Residential districts do not allow frontage, so the request is neither consistent or inconsistent with the urban form map. Overall, the request is consistent with the comprehensive plan. Consistent policies include policies that speak to future land use map consistency, reinforcing the urban pattern, so development would be of a similar scale to existing development, adding additional housing types to be built on the site, and increasing total housing on the site. No inconsistent policies were identified, and your deadline for action is December 10th. Happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you. And with that, the applicant and those in support have a total of 10 minutes to speak.
Good morning. Tom Johnson from the firm of Williams Mullen at 301 Fayetteville Street, Suite 1700 here in Raleigh on behalf of the applicant. This is just a situation where we were removing some conditions from 2004 to allow for more density on the site. And the new condition we added was based upon staff recommendations for the Greenway connection. I'm available to answer any questions you may have, but we obviously concur with the staff recommendation.
Thank you. And are there any members of the public here to speak on this item? Oh, one. Yes. Please come to the podium. There's those in opposition have a total of 10 minutes to speak.
Good morning. My name is Kevin Peterson. It's not that I totally disagree with the building of said homes. I've met with the gentleman who's building the said properties. The issue that I have is further down Crosslink Road, there are a group of apartments for lower income based, participants to have homes in those apartments, and they have been building for the last 2 years and haven't been completed yet. Yet these homes that are planned on being built are in the high, what they proposed were the mid 400 range, which a lot of people would be not to say, they would pretty much be priced out, for lack of better terms. And so what I was here the last time, there were a few other people from the neighborhood that was here at the last meeting, but I assume they couldn't attend this particular meeting. So I guess I'm here by myself, and I don't have a problem with that. It's just, we were hoping that something could be done where some subsidized housing could be built in this area outside of the $400,000 price range. Also, the area of land that they are building on is home to a large group of animals, primarily deer. And I have actually petitioned with the NCVAW to send a petition to go against the building of these homes. Not in disrespect, but in all fairness, the way I see it is so many plots of land in the Raleigh area where trees and animals don't have to be displaced. So many blocks of land where old buildings used to be, but I don't see anyone building on those particular properties. Just so many trees being slashed and burned, so many animals being displaced. There have been uprising in snakes in the neighborhood because around the corner from Crosslink Road, Tryon Point and another builder built some other homes, and there have been snakes and deer carcasses everywhere just because all the trees that they had, the land that they had, have been slashed and burned. So those are just the two problems that personally that I have. And I'm not really sure if there's a lot that could be done about it, but I was just hoping that if there's any way possible to change things to where people who can't afford the $400,000 price range for these homes, if there's something that could be done to where either apartments could be built or subsidized units could be, brought into the mix, something. And I'm pretty sure now is probably too late. I have sent emails, but I never received a response. So that's why I chose to come and speak up today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. Now I'd like to move to questions and comments from the commissioners. Do we have any questions or comments at the table? I guess I will start. Under the staff presentation, they demonstrate that under the new proposed zoning, the maximum number of units could be 97 conventional or 308 with 59 affordable units. Could staff elaborate on the affordable housing piece of this and also how it's mentioned in the staff report?
Sure. So the the site is within a frequent transit area, and that if a developer chose that development option, there is an affordability component where they would be allowed to build more than what would typically be allowed if they provide a specific amount of affordable housing. I believe that's 20% of newly allowed units are affordable to 60% AMI households for 30 years.
Thank you. And for the other affordable housing analysis provided in the staff report, could you provide a brief summary of that?
So the current conditions would require single-family homes or detached homes to be built, which are generally more expensive than other housing types on a per-unit basis. And so the request would allow housing types that are less expensive on a per-unit basis in the form of apartments or townhomes. And so the request would essentially allow more affordable housing types, generally speaking, on a per-unit basis.
Thank you. And there is no existing naturally occurring affordable housing on this lot?
No.
Since there's nothing there. And then from a tree conservation standpoint of what might be required, could you address that briefly?
So for sites over 2 acres, 10% tree conservation area is required. On this site, there is a stream on the sort of the bottom of the L, if you will, that would require a 50-foot Neuse River buffer. And so there may be some additional tree conservation area required along that stream.
Gotcha. And under the existing zoning today, would that be more or less or the same amount of tree conservation required today?
It would be the same amount.
The same. Okay. Thank you. Are there any other questions or comments from commissioners? Okay. With that, I would like to entertain a motion.
I will move to make a motion. Before I do, I just don't want to ignore Mr. Peterson's comments. Unfortunately, we have limited tools to deal with affordable housing right now. It is definitely an issue in our community. We talk about it a lot here at Planning Commission, so don't want to just breeze by his comments. So we appreciate you coming out today and voicing that. It is on the record and it does go to council. So I think as a community, we need to continue to have this discussion and continue to try to find ways to fix the issue that's occurring. But in this particular case, it is fully consistent. The questions that Chair Miller asked, I think, make a lot of sense. And so I'm going to move to recommend adoption of the proposed consistency statement dated October 25, 2022, contained in the agenda materials, and recommend approval of zoning case Z6222.
Thank you. And is there a second? Second. Commissioner Otwell has offered a second. All those in favor, raise your hand. Aye. Those opposed? The motion passes 6-0. Thank you. And now moving on to new business. There are 7 items on the new business agenda today. These requests have not appeared on a previous Planning Commission agenda, and we will hear a full staff presentation and applicant presentation. The first item is case E1 Z9021 at 5200 Falls of the Noose Road and 1401 East Millbrook Road. This is a request to rezone approximately 23.51 acres from residential mixed use 3 stories to office mixed use 5 stories with parking limited and zoning conditions. So we will start with a presentation from JP Manzoff.
Just noting here, the Planning Commission deadline for action is December 24th. Zoning in the area is a mix of residential and mixed use, so there's a significant amount of R4 zoning in neighborhoods in the area, and then mixed use zoning mostly along Falls of Deuce and East Millbrook Road. Here's an aerial of the site. So again, there's large areas of low-scale residential in the area. There's some commercial use with the Quail Corner Shopping Center, kind of catty corner to the site, and some office uses to the south. A few views of the site showing the existing Quail Ridge apartments that currently occupy the site. Proposed conditions. Condition 1 would limit entitlement, so it would generate equal to or less trips than at least one of 5 specified development scenarios. And those development scenarios are include office only, a mix of office residential, and then some other sort of combination of uses. And so any site plan would have to generate trips that are equal to or less than at least one of those specified development scenarios. The second condition would require that existing tenants receive notice at least 180 days prior to redevelopment of the site. This is intended to serve as notice since the existing Quail Ridge apartments are considered naturally occurring affordable housing, and that's verified through some TJ COG Triangle J Council of Governments data. Here's the existing versus proposed zoning. So the request would increase residential entitlement, would significantly increase office and retail entitlement on the areas it's going from RX to OX. The site has a higher walk and bike score than average, similar transit score to the city average, and lower transportation costs and higher job proximity than the city average. There are 2 bus routes that have stops adjacent to the site. Route 2 is a 30-minute frequency route, and then Route 23L is 30-minute peak frequency, and both have stops adjacent to the site. The request would add to the housing supply. It does not include any subsidized units. It would permit a variety of housing types and smaller units and lots than the citywide average, and it is within walking distance of transit. The site was annexed into the city after the Fair Housing Act, so no land use, specific instances of land use discrimination was found with this property. There's a higher low-income population than the city average in the site census tract, and the rent has increased, but at a slower rate than the citywide average. The requested office mixed-use district is consistent with the office and residential mixed-use and neighborhood mixed-use designations on the site on the future land use map. The request includes a parking limited frontage, which is consistent with the transit emphasis corridor designation on the urban form map. And the request is consistent overall with the comprehensive plan. Consistent policies speak to future land use map consistency, complementary land uses, and encouraging nodal development in areas designated for mixed use and at the corner of two major public streets. Policy LU 10.3 speaks to limiting retail uses in areas designated on the future land use map to limit retail uses like a office and residential mixed use designation. And then policies speaking to increasing housing supply and also consistency with the frontage recommendations of the urban form map. There is one inconsistent policy. There is some low-scale residential directly across Quail Ridge Drive to the north, and this policy would recommend building height to be 3 stories at the right-of-way and transitioning back from there, and that this request does not include a building height transition to those low-scale residential properties. Your deadline for action is December 24th, and there are no outstanding issues. Happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you. The applicant and those in favor have a total of 10 minutes to speak.
Good morning, Commissioners. Molly Stewart, Morningstar Law Group. If this request sounds familiar, it has a lot in common with the request you heard recently related to the Montecito and the Montecito West communities. Those are also managed by Drucker and Falk. And again, Kelly Falk is here with me this morning in case there are any questions regarding operations. The Quail Ridge apartments were built between 1968 and 1970 as new market rate apartments at that time. This has been and continues to be a well-respected community operated by second-generation owners, and they are seeking to bring the entitlements for these properties in line with current city policies and needs. As at Montecito, there's no plan to redevelop at this time, and the requested rezoning will permit the certainty that's needed to understand what the possibilities are for this site. So what would be the impact of the requested rezoning? With respect to housing, the impact is here on your screen. We've heard some feedback that the requested rezoning, and this is a quote, will remove naturally occurring affordable housing if approved. In this case, the existing zoning permits plenty of room to expand by allowing an additional 674 dwelling units on the site. That's without rezoning. The incentive exists today. By spreading those units out under a lower maximum height under the existing zoning, it actually increases the area that's needed to provide those units. By comparison, the increase in entitlement that's requested is quite modest, increasing the number of dwelling units by 21% over those that would be permitted today. So while those are meaningful housing units, the vast majority of that increase could be done today. This request does additionally permit both office and retail uses, as well as personal services such as hair salons under that requested office mixed-use zoning. The requested OX zoning is different from the request made at Montecito and at Montecito West, for which RX zoning is requested, and this is in direct response to city policy in this area, as is reflected in the future land use map that you saw. In both cases, the requested zoning is most consistent with the mix of mapped designations that we see on that future land use map. I'll note that we've also heard a request for additional retail opportunities at this site, and that opportunity is offered under the proposed OX zoning. For a fully residential use of the site, as I mentioned, the proposed zoning permits some additional flexibility in layout, and it does that by reducing the number of first floor units needed. So you see that under that existing zoning, you need to have 307 first floor units, and with the proposed zoning, even with the increase in number of units, allowing the 5-story configuration reduces the required footprint for those units. And finally, we've heard a strong interest in having extended tenant notice in the event of any redevelopment at this site, and that has been provided here. So in summary, the requested increase in entitlement is a modest one. It's aligned with the city's policies for the mix of desired uses in this area, and it will permit increased housing supply by 189 units, according to the Envision Tomorrow analysis. It will provide the flexibility to provide those additional uses if they are a good fit for this location in the future, or it could remain residential as well. Also, it provides a longtime property owner who has provided housing at this location for over 50 years to proceed with their long-term planning and to continue to do their part to meet the city's needs going forward. I'd like to reserve the remainder of our time to respond to any questions that we hear.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Are there any members of the public here signed up to speak or that would like to speak on this item? Oh, yes, please. Please come to the podium and share your name and address.
Good morning. My name is Barnett Adler. I live at 5208 Saddle Court, and I am within the 500-foot buffer of this property. I'm not speaking against it per se, but I would just like to I've been to several meetings on this, and there's also a property directly across the street that right now is under a current zoning increase under the same basic rules of going from 3 stories to 5. The property catty-cornered is Quail Corner Shopping Center, which has gone through a significant rezoning that has not actually, the construction has not happened, but the zoning case has already come into play. This is a major intersection in North Raleigh, and each of these properties will have an impact on how that traffic flow works for the neighborhood and for the city. And I would just ask the Planning Commission to actually be dynamic in their thinking and plan for this, not just respond to each project individually. And I know there are limitations on what you can do, but this can be researched. We're looking at a potential 5-fold increase on 23 acres on a major intersection in North Raleigh. That's going to have an impact. The property across the street is going from 3 to 5 stories. That's going to have an impact. All these things need to be taken into account, and you need to plan for the growth in North Raleigh or in Raleigh in general. That's what we need you to do, and not just look at each property individually. Again, there are recommendations that can be made to the City Council on this, and we really need, as residents, we need you to be dynamic. I am not against growth, not against them redeveloping this property, but we need to think ahead and plan for what Raleigh's going to be and not just rubber stamp each property one by one. And I would really implore you to think about that with these projects that are coming up. Thank you.
Thank you. Would the applicant like to respond to concerns about traffic?
Thank you. This may actually just be helpful information. I obviously defer to staff on this, but it may be helpful to understand that as site plans come in for these various properties and they are required to do any sort of traffic study at that time, those traffic studies would be required to look at other development that we know is coming. So they're not sort of done in a vacuum, ignoring development that we know is coming, even if it's not there on the ground today. So that may be just helpful to understand that those are things that are taken into consideration, and that's baked into our development process here in Raleigh.
Thank you. Thank you. Now I'd like to move to questions and comments from commissioners. I may start here, and I was going to see if staff could come and speak to what type of traffic study would be required and any traffic improvements in connection with development on this site.
So good morning, I'm Monique Guyant with Transportation. So as far as the traffic requirements for the site, given at site plan, it would be required like our typical TIAs. So they would have the studied intersections, possibly the surrounding network, and in addition, it would take into account any adjacent approved and planned developments that are taking place in the area.
Thank you. And if those were determined to meaningfully impact traffic in a way that's inconsistent with the city's goals for traffic policy, what would the impact of that be?
If the study recommendations are in conflict with our policies, in order to have an approved site plan, there would have to be an agreement with those mitigations. So we would definitely look at some multimodal improvements that we can have in this place, ensuring that there's, already our comp plan requires the separated bike lanes, but just ensuring that we have bike and pedestrian safety. And additionally, with the site plan, there could be additional connectivity within the site that can provide more spaced out connections to disperse the traffic that's generated from the site.
Thank you. So just to summarize, during the actual development phase, this project would have to undertake a traffic impact analysis or a TIA, and if the results of that study were to demonstrate that there were issues, then they would have to make certain road improvements at that time in connection with the development. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. Thank you.
I'll also note that in the trade reviews, there's some other significant projects going on up and down Falls and the Noose Road and in the Midtown area, including a interchange upgrade down with Falls and 440 that would ease traffic some through, allow more cars to come through there, and a bunch of sidewalks are going in, and I believe that we have frequent transit service, not BRT, but a 15-minute bus service will eventually be coming up Falls of the Neuse as part of the Wake Transit Plan. So there are larger transportation plans for the area outside of this one site.
Thank you. Any other comments from the table? Yes, Commissioner Rainey.
Thanks, Chair Miller. I noticed in the staff report that there was a comment about block perimeter being 2,500 feet recommended, and the current is 6,000. Has there been discussions with the applicant on providing more connections through the site?
I'm not aware of specific conversations. However, definitely at site plan that will come up into play, because that's, given that the site would not, if the site does not have any block perimeter exemptions, that would be required at site plan that they do meet block perimeter standards.
Oh. Thanks.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions? I'll ask one. We received some emails about this as well. Obviously, this and the Montecito apartments are naturally occurring affordable housing units today. And I just wanted to see if well, I guess first is a question from staff. I just wanted to confirm, under the existing zoning today, would any affordable housing units be required to be built?
No, there's no requirements in the existing zoning to that would require housing affordable to below market rate households.
Thank you. And we received some emails about concerns that they wanted essentially a way to require that the existing naturally occurring affordable housing sort of not change. Is there anything that the city can do to stop development under the existing entitlement?
The property owner could offer zoning conditions to that effect, but no, there's nothing that the city can really do to require a private property owner to preserve units on their property.
Thank you. Any other comments? Okay, seeing no other comment, I would like to entertain a motion.
For Z9021, that's the right one, right? All right. I move to recommend adoption of the proposed consistency statement dated October 25th, 2022, contained in the agenda materials, and to recommend approval of the zoning amendment. The request would increase housing supply in the area and potentially provide a greater mix of uses for retail and walkable communities.
Thank you. We have a motion. Is there a second?
Second.
Commissioner Rains has seconded. All those in favor? Those opposed? The motion passes 6-0. The next item on the agenda is case E2, or I'm sorry, item E2 is case Z2422 at East Whitaker Mill Road. As we noted at the beginning of this meeting, this case has been deferred to our next Planning Commission regular meeting on November 8th, 2022. So moving on to item E3, this is rezoning case Z3822, 7640 at Oak Hill Drive. This is a request to rezone approximately 26.22 acres from the manufactured home zoning district to residential 6. This is a general use case. And we'll start with a staff presentation from Donald Belk.
Good morning again. Your deadline on this case would be December 24th. And note, this is zoned for manufactured home. It is within an area that's predominantly residential. As you see here, the site is located east of I-540, north of Buffalo Road. There has been substantial rezoning activity in this location over the last couple of years, as noted here. And you'll see today's case with the yellow star and Z51 2022, which is now before council for the public hearing. So a lot of activity here in this particular area. South of the site, note this is an area where an existing subdivision, Milburnie Ridge, is currently under construction. Some street views along Forestville Road, which runs to the west of the site, and this is an area where the Forestville Road, the city-owned Forestville Road property is located. So right now, there's really no direct frontage of this property on Forestville Road. Ultimately, at development, there would be a connection made out to Forestville. Here are some street views, a couple of images from existing existing county subdivisions that are near the site on Phlox Road and Trellis Court. Also, an image here from Buffalo Road and Pikes Peak Drive, which is part of the Milburnie Ridge development. It's about a 26-acre site. The density would increase from 4.6 to 10.68. Maximum units, note attached homes could yield 280, townhomes 168, and note the setbacks. This does score low in our transportation energy analysis. It is more or less totally auto dependent, minimal bicycle infrastructure. There is no transit service. So the Transportation Cost Index and Job Proximity Index are both lower than average. It does add to the housing supply and permits a variety of housing types along with smaller units. And note some of the demographics here. From the EJ screen, higher percentage of minority, but slightly lower low-income populations, slightly higher under age 5 populations, and slightly lower senior population. The rate of increase in median gross rents is slower than the city average, and we found no restrictive covenants or historical covenants that restricted racial groups. The proposal is consistent with the future land use map designation of low-scale residential. There is no urban form guidance. We do find that this proposal is consistent overall with the comprehensive plan. Note these consistent policies and no inconsistent policies noted. I would like to point out that we did have discussions with the applicant because this rezoning site is within an area that has been identified in other cases as being an area where Raleigh Fire is looking at insufficient response times. Of course, this is an ongoing matter we have been addressing with rezoning applicants. The Z5122 rezoning and a recent Rivertown rezoning proposal does account for a future site for a fire station. The ramifications for this particular applicant, if development occurs before the fire capacity issue is resolved, it may result in higher fire insurance rates for those homeowners in the future. Your deadline for action, again, is December 24th. There are 3 meetings coming up in between. No outstanding issues. And the applicant is here. I'll be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. The applicant and those in support have a total of 10 minutes to speak.
Good morning. Andy Mills with Shenandoah Homes here in Raleigh. So this property, as Mr. Belk's already addressed, is currently manufactured housing. We're proposing the R6. The neighborhood that is currently under development, as you see with the lots just right there below our site, is Milburnie Ridge. This is a project that we have under development, and I think I've actually recorded a few phases. Currently, we have 3 stub-out roads to this property, which we will utilize that to make the connection through our property. We've had some discussion with the city in regards to the Forestville Road property. Our understanding is a future park site. spoken with them about creating some walking trails or greenway connections to adjoin that park property as they move forward with their plan. We also will look at making any connection to the north, of course, to the east, and as you see, the west, we're just going to be limited. We won't be able to have a connection there due to existing home sites. Overall map of the future land use, we're going to stay consistent with that, with the low density residential. This is just an aerial view that we took that just shows currently it's just a wooded parcel of property. And it's just a little breakdown of between the manufactured homes, what's allowed versus on the R6 that we're requesting. Here, we're just going to look at continuing on with the current residential development we're doing to the south on Milburn Ridge, adding in the residential components, excluding apartments and civic buildings, open lots, tiny homes. So I'm here if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any members of the public here to speak on this item? Okay. Well, then we'll move to questions and comments from the commissioners. Do we have any questions or comments?
How much of our city allows manufactured housing? How many zones do we have?
There's just one zoning district that permits mobile homes, and that's MH. And there's, I don't know the exact acreage, but a very small amount in the city.
And just to be clear, there's currently no manufactured homes there. That's just what
That's right. It's a vacant site.
I see. I had just a question.
Could I clarify that last comment quickly? The manufactured home housing type is allowed as an EDU, right? It's just not as a primary unit?
That's correct. And there's a distinction between what's a manufactured house and a mobile home. Those are two different things.
Gotcha.
So a mobile home is only allowed in MH.
I see. Thank you.
I just had a question about the fire response time concern, because certainly property reimbursement is a concern, but I think that personal safety is a much higher concern. Are there other places in the city where the response time is similar? I guess I'm wondering how we handle similar situations and how and when that would get remedied. It seems concerning that we would put citizens in a situation in which they have less than favorable emergency response time. I just don't know how common that is.
So it's a good question, and I agree with you. I don't have an answer to how common that is, so I don't know the scope to which this is present in the city. What I do know is that staff and the applicant have talked with the fire department about service to this property and have determined that it's the service time is delayed a bit, but it's not of grave concern to the city. So this is a larger topic of discussion that we in the planning department are having with the fire department about service times throughout the city and future needs for facilities and equipment.
Well, I guess along those lines, I was curious, in the staff presentation, it said there were no inconsistent policies, but in the staff report, LU 2.6, zoning and infrastructure, is still called out in the staff report.
Yes,
so how did we get from one to the other?
That is because of that fire insufficiency. So we are in discussions with, of course, with fire, with a number of different rezoning applicants to resolve the issue. The issue is really, it's an area, that Buffalo Road area north, in the northeast, and then the southeast area south of the Neuse River. And so anytime a rezoning case comes up that is impacted by that issue, we will certainly point it out. But there are discussions ongoing regarding dedication of land, discussing with rezoning applicants about possible conditions. In this case, because we have the city-owned Forestville Road tract, we we have broached the subject with Parks about the possibility of having a temporary fire station location at this site. And depending on how those discussions go with Raleigh Fire, just down the street along Buffalo Road at the Rivertown site, there is a condition that would require dedication of at least a 2-acre site for a station. So there are some options in the works to address that. In this case, we did discuss the matter with the applicant, but did not suggest any specific conditions on their part because of the proximity to Forestville and the fact that Rivertown is already making a dedication.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments from the table?
I guess I'll just generally say that I'm still uncomfortable in my understanding of how all this works. So is there another point in the development process at which we would not allow housing units to be built because of the concern for fire safety? Or does this not rank? Is it just less than other places in Raleigh, but it's greater than in rural areas? I guess if this is the place where we say this is not safe for residents, then I think we need to say that. But if this is not the place where that happens, then I want to understand that better.
Sure, that's a really good question. I'll start out by saying I'm not certain what the threshold is for Raleigh Fire. What we heard back from them is that service times would be slightly extended, but not to an extent that is concerning or troubling to them. Understanding and underscoring the need for additional facilities. And I think that's the most difficult part of this discussion. If we as the city understand that there is a service need for something like public safety, it's a long process to get to the point of service. And so the city, if the need were so dire, could identify that during the rezoning process and would convey that message to the Planning Commission, to the City Council. So you saw something similar to that with the zoning case at North Hills, where the scale and scope of development was flagged as being somewhat problematic from a service standpoint. So that's really the distinction that you would see from staff, is that if the service time or delivery of service was such a large gap that it was problematic, staff would call that out. That hasn't happened in this case, to my knowledge. What staff has said is there's a slight delay in service time, but it's not to a point that is concerning, if that makes sense.
Thank you. And is that evaluated as part of site plan?
I know that fire is involved in site plan review. I don't know that they speak to service times at site plan review. They're looking to specific implementation of fire suppression systems.
I would just add, this area is in the ETJ. The community expectation among Raleigh and other jurisdictions in the county is that the city will provide service here. And I think the real importance of flagging this issue here is that alerting all of us that we need to do work to provide appropriate service here as development comes online. So flagging that at time of site plan would really be too late, right? And while that service concern exists today in terms of response time, that's a current condition, right? But there's an entitlement there. There could be a park of manufactured housing there that would be in the same service circumstance. So I think flagging this as really a budget concern for the city, that we need to do work to plan for improved fire service in this area as development comes online, as the comprehensive plan envisions, just like the Buffalo Road improvements need to happen because we've planned for growth in this area, right? This is the same, very similar situation where the zoning process is really pointing out the need for some budget action on the part of the city to respond to growth.
Could we provide that as a recommendation connected with this motion?
I think I would be comfortable with that. And I also wonder if this is flagged in future cases. I know in the North Hills case, we had the fire department here to talk to the commissioners and give their perspective. That might be helpful in the future to me.
On the North Hills case, though, they did allocate property for a fire station, which is, again, at some point, someone's going to have to
Well,
go through that
So
process.
remember, there's a zoning condition on Rivertown, which is just east of here, that commits to offering a site at time of site plan on that site. This site is adjacent to city-owned property, which is envisioned for park use, but in theory could also include a
Got
fire
it.
station. And frankly, the disposition of this property, the access, makes it not a great fire station site. And then also, I think the size of the site in relationship to the land asked for a fire station, probably not necessarily reasonable, right? Like, it's just not a very big site to ask for acreage.
Oh, very good points. Thank you.
I would like to just note that the Rivertown is Z9121. And this issue also came up on a case that you heard last month, the Z5122 at the corner of Old Mill Bernie and Buffalo, the Logan Farm site. We did note that as well, but again, as Bynum mentioned, that site was only 4.5 acres, so it really wasn't, didn't work for any kind of dedication condition.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments from the table? With that, I'd like to entertain a motion, and if you'd like to include a recommendation that council review and prioritize action to provide fire and emergency services as needed to the ETJ area, feel free to do so. Yes. Sure. With that, I will move to approve case Z3822 and to adopt the proposed consistency statement included in today's agenda materials. And I'd also like to provide a recommendation to council that council review and prioritize action to provide fire and emergency services as needed in this area and other ETJ areas. Commissioner Elder has seconded. There's a motion and a second. All those in favor? Any opposed? The motion passes 6-0. Thank you. Next item on the agenda is item E4, rezoning case Z4622 at 4900 Old Pool Road. This is a request to rezone approximately 13.6 acres from R4 to residential mixed use 5 stories with conditions. We will start with a staff presentation from Don Belk.
Good morning again. Your deadline for recommendation on this case is December 24th. Mostly residential here. Note the presence of industrial mixed use and commercial mixed use and some office mixed use to the north. Aerial of the site, noting that prevalence of residential to the south and east. Closer view of that activity. Some street views here from the intersection of Old Pool and New Hope. And also south New Hope looking north and Old Pool Road looking east. Note the presence of the utility easement here. Takes up almost half of the site as it runs north to south. Some streetscape views from nearby residential areas as well. The Trademark Drive is that industrial mixed-use area to the north. One condition has been provided by the applicant that would prohibit these uses. The request is for RX5. This would entitle a maximum of 396 units and increase residential density on the site. Does score low on our transportation and energy analysis. It is mostly auto-dependent at its location and lower transportation cost and job proximity indices. There is transit near the site, approximately 0.2 of a mile at the intersection of Old Pool and Pool Road. Go Raleigh Route 18. It is within walking distance of transit, scores well on affordability analysis. It does not include subsidized units. The area does have a substantially higher population of people of color and low-income groups. The population of linguistically isolated and less than high school education and age cohorts, these are near the city averages, and the median gross rent has increased at a slightly lower rate than the city average. The request is consistent with the future land use map designation of moderate scale residential. It is consistent with the comprehensive plan overall, and with moderate density residential as noted. There is no urban form guidance here. However, the site is in close proximity to the transit emphasis corridor along Pool Road. Number of key policies of consistency. These inconsistent policies are noted. The request for RX5, this request does exceed the height guidance that's provided in Table LU2 of the comprehensive plan, and no buffering. Although the utility easement does provide a substantial buffer to the residential areas to the east, there were no conditions that provided for any kind of buffering or building height transitions with the residential areas to the south. The environmental protection condition, there was a stormwater analysis conducted for this proposal, and that analysis used the baseline of the 100-year storm event, and stormwater staff did recommend a zoning condition for the mitigation or for the accommodation of the 100-year storm event. However, no condition was offered for that. So those factors result in the inconsistencies with these policies. So that does remain the outstanding issue that I just described. There are 3 Planning Commission meetings coming up before the deadline for this case, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. The applicant and those in support have a total of 10 minutes to speak.
Good morning, Mac Paul, Morningstar Law, 421 Fayetteville Street, here on behalf of Rohr's Company. I have with me Kevin Sturgeon with Rohr's. We also have Brian Richards and CJ Bean with Urban Design Partners. As you heard, this site is a somewhat constrained. You know, it's at a hard intersection at Old Pool Road, New Hope. It's got a large Duke Power easement that separates the developable area from the adjacent townhome community. I just want to make the point with the surrounding zoning, it is on the other quadrants a pretty heavy commercial zoning. So this is really the only residential zoning in that quadrant, which is one of the reasons we are seeking RX5. Also, this is a project, and you're going to hear from Kevin in a moment, that they are pursuing for a tax credit workforce housing development. As you're probably aware, you have to have your zoning in place to apply for the tax credits and all the other financing to execute an affordable housing project, which is how most of the affordable housing is developed in the city of Raleigh. So it's a great opportunity to meet the deficit that is growing here in the city every day. And with that, I'll turn it over to Kevin and then come back with some site-specific points.
Thanks, Mac. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me. So, as Mac mentioned, I'm Kevin Sturgeon with Rohr's Companies.
With kind of Roars being a new name to all of you here today, really wanted to take a few slides here to just introduce ourselves before we kind of get into the site-specific stuff. So Roars Companies was founded about 10 years ago. Currently today we have about 5,500 units, apartment units around the United States. Kind of where we originally started was in the Midwest doing market rate development of multifamily apartments, growing over the past 4 to 5 years. The team has grown exponentially, probably tenfold at this point, to really focus on really expanding growth throughout the United States. So a lot of us on the development team had come from a prior affordable housing developer who worked in various states throughout the United States and came over to Roars over the last couple of years to kind of build out the pipeline. And so now transitioning here to today, Roars pipeline over the next 2 to 3 years is about 60 to 70% of the new construction affordable 4% tax credit projects and about 30 to 40% market rate projects still. So with that, we are a full real estate development firm. So we have obviously the development side of things. We also have a construction management team. So we, with that, we have construction managers who kind of work in place with general contractors to kind of be that conduit between the developer team and the general contractors that we hire from a third party. And then we also have a property management team who's kind of our affiliate management company. So all of the projects that we build, regardless of where in the country, are built with the intent that our management team, as soon as we start construction and lease up, they will take over and manage the property for at least 15 years. So that's, using that kind of intent as we come into new cities that we have not developed yet, but also existing cities. I think that's something that we really like to hone in on because, as we're going through the design process, working with city staff, kind of working through all parts of the development, that's something that, we want to, have the desire and align with the city's goals, and the fact that this isn't something that we're just going to build and sell. It's something that, we're going to be with in the community for the long term. So when it comes to design, what the city's desires are, that's something that we like to just mention as important to us as something that we're going to, be and maintain ownership in the property for a long time. So with that, as Mac mentioned, the intent of this proposed project is being financed through the 4% tax credit program through the North Carolina Housing Finance Agency, being coupled with tax-exempt bonds, which would be issued by the Raleigh Housing Authority. And so with that, although rents, would be maintained at an affordable level over the entire period of affordability, I just wanted to show a few example amenities from projects that we have built at Roars Companies to show kind of the distinguishing factors between the quality of the project, the product that we provide, although it's kind of the affordable workforce housing type, and rents are maintained at an affordable level. As far as amenities and the quality of construction is virtually identical to a lot of the new market rate apartments that you see built today. So a lot of these example amenities, although we're early in the design process for this project, will be applicable to kind of our project. So just kind of wanted to show the quality of the work there. So with that, thank you, and I'll turn it back over to Mac for the remainder of the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. I'll be quick here. These are just some area sites. You can see the Duke easement, the separation from the adjacent townhome development necessitated by the easement, the opportunity for significant upgrade to the streetscape sidewalks along New Hope Road and Old Pool Road that will be required as part of any development on this site. And then finally, the site plan itself. It does lend itself to the ability to put the surface parking in the easement area, which reduces the cost of the construction and allows for a lower price point with the rent. So it's an attractive site for a more workforce housing type of development. We do, as I mentioned, have folks from Urban Design Partners here. The one issue cited by staff related to the stormwater, we did do an analysis of the basin, which is kind of a new thing that the staff is asking for in a lot of projects. The reason we have not at this point committed to a 100-year storm is because we did do the analysis for it, And based on, preliminary information, it's possible to construct it. The concern is that there has not been a site plan developed yet, and depending on, there's very significant grade here. It could end up being extremely expensive with retaining walls to build such a detention facility. And I think we're all mindful. Every day we read stories about, the cost of housing and all the layers that we've kind of placed on ourselves for good reasons, but it's led to a situation where it's become difficult to build more moderately priced housing. So we've been resistant to committing to something without having done a full site plan at this point. And it really came up in the context of pre-existing issues off-site, not on this site. So, obviously we would have to meet to the standards that the city has. And, Brian and CJ are here to answer questions you might have. Thanks.
Thank you. Are there any members of the public here that would like to speak on this item? Okay, well, that will bring it back to the table. Any questions or comments from the planning commissioners? Commissioner Rains?
Thanks, Chair Miller. For the applicant, I saw that on the site plan, looks like there's if I'm reading this right, a buffer on the south edge facing the single-family housing. Would you entertain that being a condition to be added? First question. And second question, you're talking about affordable housing, workforce housing. So that's an essential component to this, or is there an option in the future that this will be developed as full market rate? The last question, I think is for staff. Off-site flooding issues. I understand the concern about cost, keeping costs down. And if it's truly something that initiated off-site, I'd like to have the city kind of talk about options for that.
All right, so thank you for the questions. I'll try to answer them in piecemeal here if I recall them correctly. So to your first point about conditioning kind of the south portion of the site, I think Brian might be able to opine a little bit about that. But that's something that from a design standpoint and the topography of this site, there's kind of two things. I think from the topography standpoint, really our buildable area is really on what's shown in the picture here on the top right, but it's really the northwest of the site due to all the topography issues. So in order to preserve for some of the stormwater retention and align with kind of the city requirements for the tree save, that's where we kind of hit those requirements at the south end of the site. Also with obviously in the intention of being the kind of good neighbor, if you will, and providing a buffer to any single family homes that existing there. So Brian, I guess, I don't know if you...
Yeah, if you answer the market question on the workforce, and then I can touch on all that.
Sure. Yeah, sorry to bounce around here. So on the second question in regards to the kind of market rate or workforce housing aspect of it, so from that side of things, the intent is certainly to go through the 4% tax credit program. I think a couple of problems that come with potentially conditioning the site to affordable housing is, although, our 100% attention is to go through that program, but kind of working through the preliminary steps of the site plan in this process is one of the conditions in order to work through that entire financing with the state agency and with the Raleigh Housing Authority is that the site has to be fully entitled, or I guess entitled properly, if you will. And so a couple of issues that, just kind of talking out loud or thinking out loud here from a conditioning aspect is from a developer standpoint, we don't currently own the site. We currently have it under a purchase agreement, contingent upon a numerous amount of things. Inclusive of that is the financing and lining that up through the state agency and having that be a contingency of the deal. And so the problem that I think we could see with conditioning it to affordable housing more formally would be if we do that and then the current landowner, that condition happens and then for whatever reason the financing falls through. That's kind of something that would be on behalf of the current owner of the property. So kind of circling back to the original point of the intent, that is certainly our intent. I think for whatever reason, if the financing didn't work out through the 4% program, and I will say it is a non-competitive program, unlike the 9% program. So that is one thing that from a risk standpoint is kind of off the table, so that it certainly helps. But we haven't looked at it as kind of a market rate opportunity. Our full intent is a tax credit affordable housing project. Sorry, it kind of loosely answers your question, but if there's any kind of more clerical questions, I'm happy to.
For number 2, for the buffer, so you wouldn't add a condition?
Yeah, no, I can touch on that. So I think just to kind of give you a sense on site, so page left, that's the southern boundary there. There is an existing stream, so really there will be a buffer there regardless. And I think we have no problem committing to a buffer if that's required. The stream kind of goes off our page, but just the fact we have the Duke easement would keep us from being able to do buffers to some extent as well. That whole open green space is a Duke easement, but that is also required tree save. So that is, to be completely honest, the only place we could do tree save. So the buffer will be there. If a condition is required to do that somehow, I just would not want that. It would need to be written, and so they understand that Duke easement would be exempt from that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It would be outside the easement.
I don't see any issue with that. There's going to be a lot of tree save there. And one thing I just want to point out on this, especially when it comes to the stormwater issue, one thing that's really not shown on this is the topography. There's a 20 to 30, 40-foot drop from Old Pool down to the site there, or South New Hope down to the site. And so that really, you add that with the Duke easement, really constrains this site. And so that's really where our hesitation with that comes. And so our initial study was not looking at the 100-year, and then staff asked to look at it because down lower page left, which is kind of to the southeast, there was a report of a flooding issue that occurred well off site. And so we were asked to do that 100-year study and perform that to see, if we could do it. And it's really tight. And not being at full site design yet, it's really hard to say that we could commit to that. But we will make every best effort to minimize any impacts. But there's already going to be significant site walls in this property because of that grade change and the extensive road frontage and road improvements that are going to be put on this project to have to make because of the length of the road frontage.
Thank you.
Sally Hoyt, Stormwater Plan Review staff. I actually want to apologize to the applicant. I think there was some confusion with our plan reviewer. And so we do not need a rezoning condition regarding the 100-year. That's actually already in the UDO. So we don't have enough information yet to determine whether there would be treatment required for those those less frequent, higher rainfall storms. But we will be requesting that when it comes into site plan review. If the site constitutes more than 5% of the drainage area to the downstream flooding location, then the UDO requires additional analysis and perhaps additional treatment, but that's already in the UDO, so we do not need an additional rezoning condition for that.
Thank you. Sorry, one last question. This is me not understanding the process, but the applicant is not the owner of the site, but they're applying for zoning for the site. We understand there's a purchase agreement, but I guess, how does that, what if they don't fully purchase and this goes through? What happens to the zoning?
If the zoning entitlement is approved, then the zoning stays on the site. So it would be available for anyone to develop under the current zoning.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Other questions at the table?
I noticed on iMaps that there seems to be a path through this site, and okay, I think it looks like
That's
there's
just a Duke easement.
No, it looks like there's a walking path or something through the site currently. No.
I'm pretty sure it's just for Duke maintenance. Yeah.
Okay. So I didn't know if it looks like it connects on the south end of the site to another path. Is that?
Duke easement.
easement is the line.
So you're looking at the thing that's running through the length of it?
Yes.
Yeah, that's just Duke maintenance.
It's just Duke access. Okay.
I'm not saying other people don't walk on it, but that's Duke.
Sure. Okay. Okay, I think that answers my question.
Thank you. So on the affordable housing piece, this is something that comes up a lot, and I think it's really interesting. In this case, demonstrates some of the issues that we see. We obviously have affordable housing that's being built in the city. I was wondering if staff might know how much of the current affordable housing is a result of the rezoning condition instead of a tax credit program.
I'm going to answer this question completely off the cuff
Yeah.
and without any context. But my assumption is there have been 0 approved units as a result of rezoning conditions, and that everything has been as a result of a tax credit project.
Thank you. And so that's what was my understanding too. And so this case demonstrates that even though this is an affordable housing project, there are feasibility issues with the process that mean that we can't actually include it as a rezoning condition, despite the fact that this is going to be an affordable housing project. So I'm curious, and I'm sure that the city is studying this issue further, but I'm glad to see that this affordable housing project is going through, and I'm interested to learn more about, from a rezoning standpoint, since we are the Planning Commission, that's what we do, why it cannot be generally in this case, or perhaps in this case, included as a zoning condition. I believe the applicant said that in order to go through the tax credit process, the site has to be entitled appropriately from a zoning standpoint. Could you explain what that means?
I would defer to the applicant here. My understanding of the process is when you submit for a tax credit project, the entitlement must be in place to be considered for the awarding of those funds.
So it can't have a condition on it that would require the affordable housing?
I'm not certain that's true. I think that the entitlement just needs to be in place to demonstrate to the federal agency that there's a reality that the project could be built.
Okay. So in this case, the sale of the property to the applicant is contingent on both the rezoning occurring and also the tax credit process going into place. And so I think they said, so the reason, I'm just trying to clarify for my own sake, that they don't want to include it is because if the financing fails to go through, then the entitlement would stay with the existing owner of the property. And so the seller is not willing to undertake that, even though they know this is the intent. Okay. Did I get that right? Yes, perhaps.
Yeah, so I guess 2 clarification points. So on the tax credit side, when we submit our 4% tax credit application to North Carolina Housing Finance Agency, there's a pre-application process and then a full application process. And by the time we get to our full application process, the site has to be properly zoned, if you will. So it doesn't have to be specifically a condition for affordable housing. It just has to be properly zoned from a multifamily standpoint that it can appropriately suits the number of units and various other aspects from a zoning code perspective. And then, excuse me, as far as the zoning condition, yeah, from a practical matter, that's correct. I think we haven't specifically had that specific conversation with the current seller that we're under contract with. I think from my perspective, there's just more risk on the table from the fact that as the zoning is tied to the site, and if ultimately it gets approved for multifamily here, I think that just kind of constrains the current site if. For whatever reason, it falls through. This project falls through. That the current seller, even though it's zoned for multifamily, it would be conditioned to affordable. So that just really restricts any possible future buyer that might come in if they want to do any sort of multifamily or flexible kind of workforce housing. It could be just another layer of something that they might have to work through. So that's I guess, my answer to that. So thank you.
Thank you. Sure. And did you offer the information that the sale of the property to the applicant is contingent, the sale itself is contingent on receiving, on a successful tax credit approval process?
Yeah, so that is a condition of the purchase agreement as
Okay.
it lays out. And so I guess, I will clarify that's, the purchase agreement between us as the buyer and the current owner of the property. And so, there's certain default measures with it. I won't get into it too much, but, let's say it's just a contingent for the buyer. So for whatever reason, if that falls through, legally speaking, we could waive that. It's not like we would do that from a practical matter because our intent is what we're proposing here. But from a legal perspective, that we could do that. But yes, it is a contingent of the purchase agreement.
Okay.
So.
Thank you.
Yep.
Other questions at the table?
Just one thing. It sounds like maybe there's this, we're going to hear this again with condition. Is that a buffer condition? Is that something that we heard from the applicant they were comfortable with? Okay, I might just ask, I'm not sure I understood the stormwater comment. Like, is it 5% of, is the parcel is the requirement of a 100-year storm treatment or retention if it's, the parcel is 5% of the contributing drainage basin, or the impervious is 5% of
It's if the parcel land area is 5% of the total watershed or drainage area to the site of the structural flooding.
Is that a clarification that we might be able to have more insight on if we're going to hear this again next time?
Yes, we could have
if it's parcel based, not site plan based. Thank you.
Yes.
Thanks. Commissioner.
Questions. Noticing in the in the staff report in the transportation and transit review, it mentions that the parcel would be subject to block perimeter standards, and that it would. I was wondering how those would be implemented. I was looking at the design potential, the drawing of the potential construction. How would a block perimeter? What could be accomplished as far as reducing the block perimeter here, and is it going to be subject to those standards? Will we connect through to Stone Manor Drive, or would it be just an internal connection between Old Pool and New Hope?
Hello.
Sorry, is it possible for us to look at that site plan while we're just, I don't know who's in charge of the PowerPoint. Thank you.
Okay, so as far as block perimeter standards, looking at the site and looking at the existing townhome development that's adjacent to the site, it didn't look like there was an actual like stub and a stub with the intent on having like a vehicle access. It more so looks to be access for the Duke, like a Duke easement access type situation. So we weren't really looking as to expecting them to have a street stub, expecting them to connect to the townhome development.
Okay, so the maximum, the parcel exceeds the maximum block perimeter, but there's not really much that can happen at site plan to reduce that. Excuse me.
Correct. Yeah, I believe that there may be an exception if there is a utility easement on that site, which the Duke easement is fairly large on the site.
Okay. Thank you. And I had a question for the applicant. I also noticed that the staff pointed out there's a sidewalk gap between the potential project site and the sidewalks that connect through to the Neuse River Trail. And I was just urged the applicant to consider including that condition to fill that 300-foot gap. I think it'd be a wonderful amenity for the potential residents of this site.
I'm not sure we're comfortable knowing what that looks like yet to be able to say. I think we'd have to look at that for sure.
Right.
Where that is. I think it's actually pretty far away from here, if I'm not mistaken.
I think it's the one adjacent to the...
To be completely honest, I mean, this project really has a lot of roadway improvements in frontage. It's going to be required to do just because of the shape of the site, the length of the roadway frontage, and it's already a challenging one, even if it wasn't a lot, because of the grade and the retaining walls be required to make this feasible. So I think there's already a lot of improvements that the site's going to have to tackle.
Thank you.
Site.
Could staff speak to that on the roadway improvements if they anticipate that a sidewalk will be required?
Yeah, certainly there'll be sidewalks required along the frontage of the property, along South New Hope and Old Pool. I believe, I'm not mistaken, if there's someone from Parks here that could speak to it, but I believe that was a suggestion. I believe that would entail an off-site improvement, of which, of course, the applicant would not be required to make, but certainly something they could offer.
Thank you. Commissioner Haver?
And just to clarify, the South New Hope, that frontage would actually have a multi-use trail as part of that streetscape improvement as well.
Okay, great.
So I just want to point out, I think it's ironic that we've spent way more time on a project that's proposing affordable housing than some of the other projects. I think my questions are more to protect the applicant because I think it's important. We just talked about it in earlier cases. I want to get back to the buffer and make sure, I don't see a creek on IMAPs, but if there is a creek there, then there's more significant tree protection required by code in that area, correct?
Yes, it's actually just off our site. It comes from, let's see, maybe we can go back.
I don't see it on IMAPs.
Oh,
what?
There we go. Yeah. So, can I point on this thing? Can I draw it?
Like here? No.
Oh,
Yeah, you can put your
yeah.
finger
Well, if sorry, I went too far.
I see it.
If you see across South New Hope, just south of that kind of industrial-looking commercial building just across South New Hope, you see a little pond.
Yeah, I
spot?
see the creek
It basically
now.
runs right down the edge of ours, and so pretty much where we're proposing that tree save, maybe not all of it, but a good portion of it is actually going to be stream buffer required. And so there will be significant tree save there regardless. And there's actually a significant tree, preserved tree that you'll see that's actually just south of our property too. So they already got it probably 40 feet or 50 feet of trees, and then we'll have more than that.
Okay, so not that I don't.
Sure. Go ahead.
Go ahead, what were you going to
I was
say?
gonna say, so in that case, could staff clarify would a buffer requirement in a zoning condition be required, or would a buffing condition be required to protect the trees and create a buffer in that area, or would that already be protected?
It would already be protected.
Yeah, but let's get staff to confirm that. Sorry, not that I don't trust you, but
I can respond in terms of the stream buffer. So it would require at least 30 feet of trees to be preserved and at least 50 feet of green space.
so I would prefer not to put a condition on the applicant and that's just my opinion. On the stormwater, can you confirm that the issue is downstream? I don't see any floodplains there. There is a lot of topo on the site. So the applicant, I think, mentioned that it was downstream, but I want to hear again staff say that because a 100-year storm is a significant storm event to detain. And again, that's super costly. So again, here we are with an affordable housing opportunity, and I don't want to continue to put unnecessary costs on the applicant if it's not necessary. So can you confirm that it's downstream and not on-site?
It is downstream. So one of the things that stormwater staff looks at for any potential rezoning case and any site plan that comes in is whether there is documented downstream structural flooding. And so when that is the case, and that is the case downstream of this site, the UDO requires that further analysis be done. If the property can show that they're less than 5% of the drainage area, then they don't have to take any further action. If they are more than 5% of the drainage area, they can do a study to show that that they're not causing significant impact at that site, or they can do some detention. So there's kind of, and I don't have the data at this point to tell you whether it's more or less than 5%.
Yeah, right. And sorry, again, I can't believe we're spending more time on this than some of the other ones, but how far downstream from the site is the current issues, the failures occurring?
I don't know.
Okay. And then also for staff, it is pointed out that it's a lower than average walk score. And just to confirm, that there will be improvements along Old Pool Road to get to the bus stops on Pool Road, correct? I mean, that's going to be part of the site plan approval.
Yes, that's correct. That'll be part of this, of the approval of the
Okay.
site plan, have those connections.
And this is neither here nor there, but, and I know y'all are just doing this to the applicant, some preliminary planning, but that looked like a boatload of parking. So if you're trying to save costs and you're trying to deal with stormwater, we've got new parking requirements. There's a bus route. You're going to be required to provide access to the bus routes. I just consider, especially since you're bumping up against those houses along the east, that you look at conserving some of your costs, minimizing your impervious area, and just looking at the parking that you're providing there. So that's just a comment to the applicant.
Thank you. Any other comments from commissioners? Well, in that case, given that we have addressed the buffer on the south end that will already be required without a zoning condition, the intent of the affordable housing, the stormwater issue being fully resolved, and that stormwater staff has told us that that will now be addressed by the UDO sufficiently so that we don't need a zoning condition and that the sidewalks will be required as part of the site plan. I would like to make a motion to approve this case and to adopt the approved consistency statement included in today's agenda materials.
Second.
Second. We have a motion and a second. All those in favor? Motion passes 6-0. Moving on. Thank you. Moving on to item E5, rezoning case Z5422 at Peace and West on the northeast corner of the intersection of Peace Street and West Street. This is a request to rezone approximately 2.6 acres from industrial mixed use 12 stories to downtown mixed use 30 stories, urban general with zoning conditions. We will start off with a staff presentation from Ira Mabel.
Good morning. Thank you. Commissioner Miller, your deadline for this case is in December. Merry Christmas. So this, as stated, is currently zoned IX 12. Generally, this part of downtown is the sort of northernmost. You can see transition between a lot of the maroon colors to the zoning along P Street and further north of there. So an aerial of the site with some landmarks. There's the Smoky Hollow first phase, just to the south across P Street, and some other notable developments nearby, and a bit of a closer zoom in for the current state. So this whole parking lot on to the east is the future park to be named later. I believe council will get a recommendation for that name next week from the Parks Board. Some photos from P Street looking north. One about midway up the site. It is rather long and triangular shape, so it's about halfway up on West Street, and then at the northernmost portion of the site, looking south. So a number of conditions on the request, some uses prohibited, conditions 2 and 3 limiting parking structure screening and lighting. So I'll jump ahead and say that one recommendation, this request was submitted before the recent text change was finalized. So I am recommending that those be removed. They're either equivalent or less restrictive than that code. So not really doing much at this stage of the game. Number 4 is a prohibition on surface parking between buildings and the park. Requirement for pedestrian connectivity somewhere on the eastern side, so on the park side. Requirement of a urban plaza, most likely on P Street, and then a hard cap on office uses at 500,000 square feet. So, I mean, IX12 does currently allow quite a bit of entitlement. So some of these categories, not a huge change, but certainly an increase in residential uses permitted. Fairly high walk and transit scores, being pretty close to downtown, and a lot of bus routes. I think the Route 6 is scheduled to be high frequency in the future, currently 30 minutes. And then not shown on this map but on the urban 4 map is a potential location for bus rapid transit station. Also scores a lot, accounts for pretty high in the affordability analysis, as do most, DX districts. This property has been in the city for quite a while and was part of the original planning, as far as I could tell, of the Glenwood Brooklyn neighborhood, along with the current, what remains of the Glenwood neighborhood, which all did include racially restrictive covenants in their deeds. So consistent with the future land use map, which is sort of the northernmost boundary on either side of Capitol Boulevard here, so on the west side where the site is and on the east side. Recommending a DS district, and the urban frontage consistent with downtown urban forum guidance. So consistent overall with the comp plan and the future land use map, and consistent with policies about connectivity, transit, and development downtown, including a couple of unusual ones triggered by those requirements for connectivity and the public plaza, inconsistent with one policy about development in downtown edges. So again, recommendation that those parking structure conditions are no longer really appropriate given the recent text change. Other than that, I'd be happy to answer any questions before you hear from the applicant.
Thank you. We will now hear from the applicant, and all those in favor, you have a total of 10 minutes to speak.
Yeah, sorry.
Good morning. Mac Paul here on behalf of Raleigh Development Group. My client, Christopher Carter, sends his regrets. He got COVID over this past weekend. He has been the point person for Raleigh Development Group on this project, which has been a long time coming. It's obviously a very exciting opportunity and location in the city of Raleigh. This company has been assembling this for about 20 years. Long time while the city had its fleet parked there, and long before the idea of creating a city park came to fruition. The last piece was a large parcel acquired from the Department of Transportation about a year ago, which set in motion the possibility to do a cohesive development at this site. As you can see, it's along Capitol Boulevard, a heavily traveled corridor, an old industrial zone with a lot of contaminated soils, programmed to be a park, and now the emerging Smoky Hollow area, which, by the way, is the leading candidate right now for the name of the park, but that's going to be determined in the next few weeks. These are just some further sites, photos looking back from West Street into downtown. There is Smoky Hollow Phase 3 right in the foreground on the left slide, which is coming in for site plan at 38 stories, approved a couple of years ago. And then just very kind of degraded areas, walking back along the Pigeon House Creek, I think one of the most polluted creeks in the city. You can see how has not been cared for, but a great opportunity if it gets reopened. And there's some piping on site that's going to be removed and rechannelized. So it's a super opportunity to create an urban park. This is looking north from down at the interchange at Wade. But so the future land use map comp plan, it does follow this corridor heading north and east and west. So like the areas that the Central Business District follows tends to track the spines of downtown. Were it not for the Parks and Rec designation for the park coming, that would likely be the Central Business District as well. And those have been the areas where the city has recommended the greatest heights. As you know, Raleigh did not map downtown, even though there was a lot of discussion to the comprehensive plan. So individual property owners are having to come in and go through this exercise to rezone to achieve the vision of the comprehensive plan. You're going to hear about this issue with transitions. This is the transition map. You can see, there was a lot of work that went into that back in 2009 when the city adopted the 2030 plan of where those ought to occur in areas, adjacent to existing single family. This just happened not to be one of those areas that was designated as a transition area. We, very early on, knowing that the park plan is in motion, sat down with Parks and Rec and are continuing to have a lot of conversation with Parks and Rec about the opportunities here. It's one of the few sites, really the only site adjacent to the park that has an opportunity to interface with the park and to provide some urban frontage, enclosure, and vibrancy from a development standpoint along the park. The parcels along West Street are pretty constrained between the railroad track and West Street in terms of any redevelopment. And then a lot of it is floodplain as you head north. So there really is no development that will be permitted, for instance, where the city owns a large lot on West Street with some existing buildings. In fact, the equestrian group is there, but that's all in a floodplain. So in talking to the Parks Department, this is the plan for Devereaux Meadows, soon to be changed, subject to a $275 million bond issue on the ballot in November. The opportunities that we've identified include the interface of the development on the west side of the park, programming in the park, having some share with Phil from the development for use with the park, and finally, you may remember with this particular bond, the city did not program this particular park for full funding. So there's a big multi-million-dollar gap between the bond and what will be hoped for and achieved. And one of the ideas the council has pursued are public-private partnerships in looking at how we can meet some of these infrastructure needs at the park. So one of the items is how do we get some partnership and financing or potential participation with some of the infrastructure. These are just visuals along the way. The History Walk is immediately adjacent to this site, so great opportunity to interface with this particular portion of the park. And we did make some specific zoning commitments related to the park, one of which is to do an urban plaza on P Street, which can blend in nicely and have, instead of two separate, and that's the whole idea, is don't have the development be disconnected from the park, but have one plaza that serves both the development and the park that would be a public access, as well as pedestrian access within the park, further into the park, into the site. And then you heard a little bit about the screening. The reason we had the parking deck screening was not so much the street frontage, but wanting to make sure that there's no, that the park is treated like a public street where it's well screened. We also have essentially an urban frontage facing the park, not just the public street. So you don't have like a parking lot, next to the park, but the park really is an urban frontage for the development. This just shows, and Perkins Eastman has been doing some early renderings on the site to show, obviously the park is a tremendous amenity for this site and vice versa. It'll be a place where people can actually come and, get something to eat or drink and enjoy the park. And many can park in this particular facility to access the park. So, there are a number of folks here from the Brooklyn-Glenwood neighborhood. The main concerns, and you're going to hear from folks in a minute, have been about height. And I think it's really hard for all of us to kind of envision proximity in our minds. And so, concern about what is it going to feel like being next to taller buildings. We do have Smoky Hollow coming up in the, across the street, Catacorner. But we were asked to do a number of things. And so this has been a little bit of an interesting or different exercise because, and you may recall recently, we had the Washington Street case. So I've been, interfacing with many of the folks here over the past year in a very collaborative fashion, great very good, conversations along the way. In this case, it's been more of a concern about the height and just, reducing the height. And what can you do to show us what it's going to feel like being near this development? And so we've been asked to do a number of renderings, and also traffic has been raised as a concern. And we have Tyler O'Farrell with Kimley Horn, who's collected a lot of data on the traffic, and we have a separate, series of slides if you want to pursue and get into some of the conversations around traffic. This is looking at the end. We were asked to do kind of an elevation at the end of Cleveland Street. You can see kind of the building form back to the right, but it kind of shows that the development site is really further to the south, certainly from Cleveland. This is at Devereaux. So Devereaux Street off Glenwood Avenue is the closest street to this site, and you can see obviously there the building massing across the railroad tracks and West Street from the end of Devereaux Street. This shows you from the corner of Glenwood and P Street, and you can see we did superimpose the Smoky Hollow Phase 3 as well in the background there to provide a little bit of context. We have a number of different shadow studies that we're asked to do and have done. This basically shows kind of the time of year where the shadows will actually cast the biggest shadows. So during the summer, obviously, it's a lot less. And it really just demonstrates that the shadows are in the morning, in the winter solstice. And we did include the Smoky Hollow 3 project there as well. So you can see, the early morning hours, there'll be a shadow that will go away later in the morning. And I think the point is, whether it's 20 stories or 30 stories or 12 stories, there's still a shadow cast in the winter solstice. And it will move, fairly quickly, because to the south is where the sun tends to be in the wintertime, which is south of this site. Not to say that there's no shadow cast. And as I mentioned, we have a number of slides on the transportation, and I think it shows that traffic in this area has actually declined over the last 10, 20 years, and I think it brings home something we forget about a lot, which is why we have promoted urban mixed-use development downtown, because there's so many benefits from climate, environment, walkability, reduced traffic. It allows us not to continue to sprawl, and it actually captures a lot of the transportation trips with the downtown development. So I'll just go back to kind of the urban edge here. Happy to answer questions, and again, we have our transportation planner.
Thank you. Are there any members of the public here to speak on this item? If so, please proceed to the podium. Those in opposition have a total of 10 minutes to speak. So if there are multiple people, I was just going to see if you've designated a representative. Great. Who's first? Okay. Thank you. Please state your name and your address when you begin.
Yes, Roy Atride, 501 Cleveland Street in the historic Glenwood, Brooklyn neighborhood here. These are some of the historic houses you would see along Glenwood Avenue as you head towards downtown, about 300 historic houses in the Glenwood, Brooklyn neighborhood. This is a historic map of the site showing the current development site, also an alternative site that might be more appropriate for something of this density. You can see how close it is to the Glenwood, Brooklyn neighborhood, within 250 feet of historic homes. There's a lot of data on this slide. I did share this with the commission as well as council. I'll point out that there are a lot of historic homes. Our neighborhood is also home to a lot of mixed use and infill projects. We're not against development. We just want to make sure the development appropriately addresses our neighborhood and protects it. We are on the National Historic Registry as well as a historic site for downtown Raleigh. Our neighborhood was mentioned specifically in the 2030 comprehensive plan as needing protection under transitions, buffering, and compatibility. We've had over 570 people sign a petition against this development. Back prior to the acceptance of the UDO, the neighborhood actually worked with the city on appropriate height for development in this area. We made a major concession to 12 stories from 4 stories already to try to protect our neighborhood, but also to try to make sure that we address the fact that we're in downtown. We need more density. We need more housing. But again, we didn't want to be dwarfed by development. We bought our land knowing we're in a historic district. We're restricted on height and design and other things. We abide by that. The landowner, the purchaser, purchased their land knowing there was a law setting the height at 12 stories. Not quite sure why he would be allowed to make the change for his benefit and the detriment of our neighborhood and park patrons. This is an image that shows more accurately how close the site actually is to historic houses. As Max said, it's tough to tell, but this would be a pretty overwhelming development for a large portion of our neighborhood. Staff mentioned that this met the comprehensive plan. We wholeheartedly disagree, as it completely ignores aspects of the comprehensive plan about appropriate height, engaging with existing structures, historic neighborhoods, and protecting some of the fabric of our city. We also noted that they mentioned 14 different compliances. We actually refute 2 of those compliances because it completely ignores the definition of central business district and its ability to step down to appropriately address existing neighborhoods. It also does not meet the higher density requirement of being along a major road. It is on a minor road. Most of the street frontage is on West. Staff has mentioned that it does not meet or is inconsistent with one policy. We found 5 to 8 different policies that it's inconsistent with. Yes, many of those are around height and density. Staff mentioned that it does not meet the requirements around specifically an edge condition around central business district. But they softened that criticism, saying it doesn't meet the definition of staff definition of adjacent. I looked up the definition of adjacent. Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines adjacent as not distant, close at hand. A 30-story development within 250 feet of a historic structure is certainly close at hand. They also said that it is a generous reading of the comprehensive plan that would point to a 12-story development. Many of the different conditions would point to a 12-story development as being appropriate. Other policies that this violates: buffering requirements, reinforcing the urban pattern, managing commercial development, violates the definition of the central business district, the building height transitions, density transitions, transitions to buffering zones, the comprehensive plan and section land use compatibility, and the definition of transitions itself. This is what this would look like. This is a huge development. A huge development. This would overshadow our entire neighborhood. It'd be seen for miles. This is one of the possible policies on the right that would help set a more appropriate height limit. This is what was used in the original negotiation around 12 stories. By the way, we're not happy with 12 stories either. Many people feel like it should be lower. The shadow study Mac pointed to, many houses would be in shadow multiple hours during the day, and then in glare multiple hours during the day. This is winter solstice. This is the worst case condition, but it's clear. The park would also be in shadow and glare multiple hours during the day. We would ask you to vote no. We would ask you to take this and study it further. We would ask more time be given an appropriate study. It is inappropriate to have this development next to our neighborhood. It violates many policies of the comprehensive plan and puts our neighborhood at risk. I'd like to reserve the rest of the time for other members of our neighborhood to speak. But I'd like to leave this up there. You can leave that up there.
He's got a presentation.
Oh, you got it. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Good morning, approaching afternoon. Commissioners, I appreciate your work. I appreciate it more having sat through 2 hours of it now. My name is Mark Nance at 509 Cleveland Street. I'm part of this neighborhood, and I just want to make really a couple of quick points. I'm a little disappointed from my friend Mr. Paul, whom I know otherwise, that the shadow study that was presented did not present the effect that this would have on the park. So much of the case for this building, as you saw, in fact, many of the slides that were shown were all about the park, which of course is not what they're doing. They're not building the park, right? They're building a development next to the park. And so I draw your attention to the part of the study that was not included in Mac's presentation in the bottom right-hand corner. That's the park. That's the millions of dollars that we're asking the citizens of Raleigh to pay for that park, which will be in shadows from 3 o'clock on in winter, when people most need sun, most want sun. It will be literally overshadowed, right? This is their own studies. This is not ours. And I think it's notable and disappointing that that was not included in the previous conversation by the developers. So it's also notable at the same, so it's ironic to me that this came about at the same time I was putting this together. This came in the mail, right? Great cities care about their parks. I would suggest that motto stands in stark contrast to this, where we're allowing a developer who already is allowed to build 12 stories to simply build as tall as they'd like, up to 30 stories, and allow it, again, literally to overshadow this. So I think that the irony there is worth noting. I will also say, generally speaking, I think this process, Max suggested that this has been a long time coming. It's certainly true that they've been sort of accumulating, developers have been accumulating the property for a long time. But this process of considering how to use this land and having discussions with the community has not been a long time coming. In fact, I would argue that the information has been lacking in all of this. The developers have not been forthcoming. They have provided information that we've requested. But initial community meetings, again, presented only those picturesque pictures of the park. There were no renderings of the buildings. There were no shadow studies. Apparently there are now traffic studies that have been completed. We, of course, have not seen those, notably before this hearing. And so it's hard for me to say, while we have had good conversations, this process seems to be rushing forward with very poor information. And noting Roy's points before, that the staff has said very clearly in meetings that they feel that one of their primary jobs is to ensure a speedy due process for the applicants. I would argue that their primary job is really to provide you with full information about these proposals and not simply to rush through processes, but that's where we are. And I don't think we have full information. I don't think you have full information, and I think that's very unfortunate for such an important decision as this. So I would argue finally that really if due process cannot be due process for one side, right? Due process for one side is a tilted table, and so we urge you strongly to vote no on this proposal. And I guess we'll hold the rest of our time.
Thank you. Oh, there's one more.
Thank you. My name is Ben Kuhn, 1223 Pierce Street. I live in the Glenwood, Brooklyn neighborhood. I'm just going to briefly touch on the last part. You don't have to rush on this. You shouldn't rush on this. There's too much at stake, and you all know it. You don't have to make any decision until December 24th. There are at least three more meetings. There's several committee meetings you could have. This needs to be slowed down. This requires the attention that this area of the city deserves. We've put in the investment in our neighborhood, in our homes. And this investment, this rezoning is abusive to this area. It truly is. And so you just need to slow this down. This makes no sense to push this forward. And I would ask, number one, if they want to vote, that you vote to deny it. Number two, it needs to be delayed.
Thank you. With that, I'll bring it back to the table for questions and comments from commissioners. Would anyone like to get us started? Commissioner Haver?
You're staring at me, so I guess I need to go first. I was trying to make eye contact with my fellow commissioners, but none of them made eye contact with me, so. A couple of questions to start. And again, this might be my ignorance. I noticed that the proposed zoning is a DX30 UGCU. And I know at text change about a year or more ago, we had considered adding a 30-story category. I thought that was not passed. And so my understanding, which could be inaccurate, is that by requesting a DX30 conditional, then they are conditioning this building to 30 stories, not 40, because generally the zoning classifications are DX20 or DX40. But I don't see a condition. I'm not saying 30 before everybody freaks out. I'm not saying 30 is the right height. I'm just trying to understand what the proposal is.
So the 30-story height district was placed in the zoning code. It's been about a year or more, a couple years. Yeah. So that's available.
I thought at text change, we didn't get, did that go through council, I guess? Or am I just not remembering that we approved that during text change?
It's in the code now, yeah.
Okay. Well, there you go.
And on that same technical point, I note in the staff report that the conditions listed as number 2 and 3 might no longer have the same impact based on recent text changes, and that they recommended that those 2 conditions be removed. Does the applicant have any thoughts on removing those 2 conditions?
Yes, there are a few technical corrections staff asked for, so we are happy to remove those. I just wanted to make sure in conversation with staff, which they have clarified, if we remove it, it still would require screening on the park side. That was the main reason we had added that, because as you know, when you're dealing with downtown sites in the parking screening and you have like an interior facing side of a parking deck, you used to have to apply the zoning condition to that side because it didn't face a public street. There is language in that text change about parks. So I think going back and looking at it, if we removed it, everything should be fine in terms of screening on all sides.
Yes, that is correct. Remember that detail going through text change. So just to confirm with staff, under the new parking screening requirement text change that we recently passed, even without a zoning condition, all open sides of this, any parking on this parcel would have to be screened. Is that correct?
Yeah, specifically property zone DX or urban general, and this has both. All facades shall have openings screened with active uses or screening elements.
Okay.
So I believe that would be on the park side, and then if there's more than one parking structure potentially on the site, that would count. All facades is all facades, I think is the. And then parks are then double considered in the list before that, which is if you're something other than DX. So pretty confident that the text change requires more screening than the conditions do.
Understood. Thank you. Commissioner
I'll
Hayden?
keep rolling. I'm curious, question for staff. The 2,500 square feet that's offered up in a condition, how does that compare to the open space requirement in the code?
So they are required to have 10% of the site as amenity area. So the site is 2.6 acres, so 80,000 something, 100,000 square feet, let's call it. So 10% of that is 10,000. So it's some percentage of their amenity area.
So essentially they're offering to double the requirement per the code.
No, I would think it's, if I did that math right, they are required to have a 10,000 square foot amenity area in some way, shape, or form. And that can be amenity area for a multifamily, could be like the pool area or other privately accessible. There's no requirement for amenity area to be publicly accessible. So they were committing, let's call it roughly a third, if I did all that math in my head really fast on TV correctly, to meet the public plaza definition at this certain location. There would be more amenity area that they're required to have, but that could be other stuff and look different.
The significance of the condition is that it places that space either along Peace Street or adjacent to city-owned parcels.
Yeah, absolutely. And in an effort to be consistent, I want to acknowledge that this particular condition is meeting something that I've been asking for a number of years, which is a commitment to improve the urban fabric in the areas along where pedestrians are. So I just want to acknowledge that, in my opinion, the applicant is making efforts towards that. I'm just curious the size compared to the requirement. I guess this is a question for the applicant. The condition says, shall include pedestrian connectivity along eastern boundary of the site. Mr. Paul, sounded like you are committing to making a connection to the park, but I don't read that in the condition necessarily.
Yeah, I mean, I would defer to staff I mean, they do have some suggested language for clarifying that a little, because clearly the intent is to have an additional pedestrian connection further north on the site. And you may have seen from the elevation of the building adjacent to the park, there's kind of like what we call the grand staircase that comes down into the park. So that's generally the location. We just didn't have any like specific place of where that would occur. It just says there has to be a public or access, and the staff asked if we'd make that a public access, and we are comfortable making it a public access, and we're open to like further refining it without like pinpointing it too much in location.
I'd like to maybe see you consider that if you could. To the comment to both the residents, Mr. Atrod and Mr. Nance, I appreciate the comment that great cities are defined by their parks. And as a previous designer and person that knows a little bit about urban design and design parks, I'll let somebody else tackle the issue of height, because I think I probably would like to know a little bit more about that. But creating that urban space along P Street, connecting to the park, creating an edge, I think is completely appropriate and does actually improve the park. If you look at great parks in lots of cities, parks are created by their edges. Their edges are what make them successful. So I think where we are now, I think there can be some refinement to the conditions, but personally, I think we're heading in the right direction as far as improving and capitalizing on the investment that hopefully we're going to approve in November and put public dollars to this park.
Thank you. Commissioner Raines?
Thanks, Chair Miller. I agree with Commissioner Haver's comments about the edge. One question for the applicant. There was a comment in the staff report about West Street. They said that could be an opportunity to preserve on-street parking or expand it and provide a separated bikeway. Didn't know if that was something that the applicant considered or would consider adding as a condition.
Yes. There was a lot of discussion about a year ago, and I don't know if it got to Planning Commission about the West Street section, and there's been a lot of work because it's a main north-south spine through downtown. And there was a lot of concern in this stretch of West Street from the business owners. They have that on-street parking, and they didn't want to lose it, so they were resistant. They were going to do a pop-up bike lane on West Street, and there was just a lot of concern and pushback. Subsequently to that, the city has approved a section, the two-lane undivided, that does mandate, from my understanding, the bike lane on the outside the sidewalk. So my understanding is that is going to be part of the streetscape improvement, the bike lane. It doesn't include on-street parking, though, with that new section, from what I understand. So what I've heard from staff is if we wanted to go above and beyond the section with the bike lane, we could do a two-way bike lane or parking along the street, which would take up more of the real estate of the site, but it would have the parking on the sidewalk, on the street. So the applicant is open to that conversation. If that's something that the Planning Commission feels really strongly about, they're willing to take a look at that as, I guess, an additional to the mandated streetscape.
I'd like to back those comments up and add a little bit of clarification. Having served on the Bicycle Pedestrian Commission, there was significant outreach issues with those businesses when there was going to be a pop-up bike lane going up north of P Street on West. And it's still in the plans for the bike program manager to go back and do another round of engagement with the business owners, and it's still part of the priority bike plan to install a in-road two-way facility, which is one of the priorities for the bike program over the next couple of years. And so the current desire for a two-way bike lane on the eastern side of the road, I think, is what the condition was trying to get at, to preserve what's going to be put in if it makes it through the public engagement section. And I would urge the applicant to work with the bike program manager and the transportation staff to see if there's some kind of condition that could be worked out.
Thank you. Other questions and comments? Tackle height. Commissioner Dautel.
Thanks, Chair Miller. Yeah, maybe just to start the conversation about height. Yeah, I think in my mind, I think that's the main issue here. I appreciate the neighbors' concerns. Obviously, I think I understand where they're coming from. Also, I think I understand where staff is coming from regarding the interpretation of some of the policies. I think I will say, just to make a statement, in my opinion, I think the policy regarding downtown edges, I mean, when you look at the site in relation to the surrounding area, it does kind of stick out as far as a downtown designation does kind of stick out as a bit of a peninsula into the park and with the housing to the side. So it does seem to make sense that even though it may not technically be directly adjacent to those residential areas, it's really close to those residential areas, and it does seem like an edge since it is surrounded by things completely other than central business district uses. So I guess I would encourage the applicant to look at maybe a more, is there some way to kind of compromise with that? Would they be interested in looking at conditions that require the height to taper off as the site moves to the north, or something like that to, address the fact that density towards P Street makes sense, but maybe that amount of density as it moves to the north of the site may not be as appropriate?
Thank you. Would the applicant like to respond?
We can take a look at that. Clearly with the massing, it's a oddly configured site, so it narrowly, it tapers down as you head north, so it prevents kind of fully building toward the north. At some point, you just can't put any structure on the site. So the massing will be situated at Peace and West. They are anticipating multifamily, which does have a much kind of smaller floor plate than an office development would. The early plans that have been worked on, I alluded to Perkins and Eastman looking at some of the massing. I mean, I think, the preference would be to not have the building that's tall above the structured parking, because it is more mass at the corner of Peace, and to have a taller, slender building next to it to the north. But I appreciate your feedback, and, it's something that we can discuss. But I think I just wanted you to understand kind of the thinking of, with the massing and the configuration of the site, where there tends to be best place to situate buildings.
Thank you. And on the height concept, I would echo those same comments and the concerns here. As a planning commission, we constantly see we're trying to figure out how we address the explosive growth in the city and the housing crisis that we're constantly seeing. And, frequently in these downtown areas, we always ask, if not here, where are we going to put density? And I think allowing greater density along an urban core, near rapid transit lines, along a city park, is exactly sort of in line with what we're trying to do as a city. And at the same time, we have to figure out how to balance that appropriately with the existing neighborhoods and the history and existing uses surrounding that area. So generally supportive of more height and density in this area, absolutely. But I do want to dive in a little bit deeper on the impact in the surrounding neighborhoods. So in particular, that shadow study, I know that that's of concern. And I believe that you had mentioned, the applicant had mentioned, regardless of whether it's 12 stories or 20 stories or 30 stories, the impacts would be similar. Certainly with respect to putting a shadow on the park, I understand that. That's going to occur in the winter months in the afternoon, regardless of the height. seeing as how it's immediately adjacent. But I was going to see if first of all, if you would agree with that, with my assumption there, that having a shorter height wouldn't necessarily make a difference on the impact on the shadows of the park, but then also addressing just providing more information about the shadow impacts of lower stories on the neighborhood to the east, to the west. I'm looking at this right, for the applicant.
Yes, we have a number of studies that we did, and I think that's really, part of this has been an exercise for all of us to get educated about the issue of impacts. As you said, I mean, we have to really be good stewards of our downtown area because we have such a limited footprint, and we have to take advantage of that to absorb that growth that we want to see happen. At the same time, we have a legacy in Raleigh, which is a great thing about Raleigh, with these historic, beautiful neighborhoods that are closer in than you would see in a lot of cities that had a real industrial phase. You know, we were a government town. And so this is an interesting site because, yeah, it's, you know, it's this edge, but there's a railroad track and a street and other buildings in between it. But it's, you know, you can see, I can understand why there's some apprehension from the community and why we're going through this exercise to have the conversation, to do the shadow study. So I think the question is based, as we get this information on the table for conversation, where does it lead us? And if we, you know, as I said, I mean, the shadows, as we've shown in the very worst time during the winter in the morning, are going to cast a shadow regardless of the height, if it's the 12 stories or higher. If it's taller, the shadow will linger a little longer. So what's the benefit? And we've done it from like at 8 a.m., noon, 10 a.m. to see it throughout the day. And again, I feel like if we reduce the height, it's not materially changing that situation in the morning. I'm not a neighbor, so they're going to experience it. So it's a cost benefit. Is it worth limiting a development in a really important site that, you know, has a lot of reasons that we want to, you know, create that opportunity and reduce that for what do we get in return for that? And I would say it's a limited duration because it's going to be there anyway during the morning, during the winter.
Thank you. Do you have anything any visuals that might be helpful to demonstrate the impact of 12 stories versus 30 stories?
Yes, I don't know if you can help me get back. Okay, well, let's see it there.
Oh, was that the one? I just can't see it.
We did a comparison of the two. If you get it, I know I've got it in mind at the end. Okay. Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Mark. Yeah, so here on the left side is the proposed zoning height, and then on the right side is with the 12 stories. This is during the summer, you know, early morning, 8 a.m. So, you know, there's a little bit of shadow. There's some shadow across the railroad track there at 8 a.m. with the taller and not on the 12-story. In the wintertime, there is a shadow in both scenarios. And by 10 a.m., there's no shadow. And we have other times of year, if you want to look at that at the end of mine. Okay, here we go. Thank you, Mark. So yeah, this just shows at 10 a.m. you can see, you know, the shadow is the same in both scenarios from the standpoint of being on the eastern side of the railroad tracks. And this is at noon, I believe, with the rezoning.
Mr. Paul, I believe all these studies were emailed to us priorly. I remember seeing these attached to, I think the commissioners have access to these studies. Is that correct?
I'm not sure if you do. I mean, you will.
They were linked in an email that was shared. I do think there is a slide that shows the 3 o'clock or 5 o'clock and 12, or 3 o'clock and 12 which I think is a good question.
Is it just further in?
Yeah.
Here? Not sure which. In our slides, the ones that I showed earlier did include kind of the Smoky Hollow development, which is, you know, slated to be built, which has essentially the same shadow, but for a little further to the south. But in terms of like depth.
Understood. Well, to Commissioner Dautel's point, I think that it appears that portion to the north provides sort of the longest shadow in these scenarios.
current site plan, there are two 30-story towers, one at the north and then one at the south end of the site.
Thank you. Yes. So that's helpful to dig in and see. And I know we received much of this. I'm trying to read some of the other details from other emails into the record to make sure some of it's getting here. But we do obviously receive all of these comments. And the impact on the park of 12 stories versus 30 stories, is that a meaning? I don't imagine, since it's immediately adjacent, that's going to be a meaningfully different impact, whether it's 12 or 30. In terms of starting at 3 p.m. in the afternoon, it'll start and continuing on the rest of the day. Would that be accurate to say?
It's less. At 12, it's less than 12 than it is at 30.
Right, for a couple minutes perhaps.
It's about a third of the shadow coverage when you're going from 12 to 30. A third of the time, a third of the space.
On the park as well?
Sorry, was that a question for me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I mean, so I think a taller building will have more shadow, I think, in as much as solid objects block light. But I've not heard from parks that they are concerned either way about shadow in particular.
I would point out that even during some of the cooler months in this climate, if you go into any public space during the summer, people gravitate to shade, period. Mm-hmm. So that's just a fact of life. You can walk around tons of parks. Apparently, someone doesn't agree with me there, but like I said, that's 30 years of experience of doing site development. So if I'm that far off, I probably wasn't successful at my job. But I have a technical question for staff, and I should know this. Remind me how we changed the text to measure building height, because I do see there's some areas there's 20 plus feet of grade along the site. So the 30 stories, not suggesting we approve it. I'm just trying to understand where that's measured from. And again, I should know that, but I think it'd be good for all of us to hear that again.
So I'm not quite as familiar with the most recent, but I do believe it is you take the average grade, and an applicant does have the ability to have multiple modules of height if you're constructing multiple buildings. So most likely we would measure each building independently if there are two, for example. So the West Street does go up from Peace. So if there's a separate tower further north of Peace, then it would be the average grade of whatever that frontage is. So from an absolute standpoint, if you're standing at the intersection of Peace and West, any independent building, the further north you get could be higher from that sight line, if that makes sense. I can bring up, there's a cartoon in the UDO if that would be helpful.
Does it I'm seeing it now visually. It might not help the folks that are in the audience, but perhaps there's an opportunity there for the applicant to create some conditions that can help alleviate some of the neighbors' concerns. I don't know.
So I had some of the same questions. I looked up the averaging of the heights. I assume that the shadow studies are based, that might be a question too, are the shadow studies based on the highest elevation on site or the lowest elevation on site? It looks like the properties on the other side of West Street are still at a higher elevation. I wonder too if those properties were redeveloped under their current entitlement, what would be the shadow impact, considering the ground elevation is higher buildings could be built there.
Restricted to
crest above Tilden Street, and so the neighborhood sits above West Street, and so a four-story building on those edges would cause far less shadow within the neighborhoods, and those are restricted to 4 stories.
Under their current zoning, right? So, okay, that does help. I was not noticing that the neighborhood itself is actually higher. And I will just say I tend to be one of the people that gravitate towards the shade in the summer at the park. Commissioner O'Haver, I would also, question, just out of curiosity, what is the tree cover situation planned for the park and how that may or may not affect the shadow? And it may be too early to say that.
There's some rough concept plans that Raleigh Parks has shared. I don't think they plan to do a lot of planting on the bulk of the site. It is going to be, they call it a passive park, so no like ball fields or anything. It is currently, basically the 100% of it is in the floodplain now, which is a primary goal of developing the park. So I don't think they're planning a lot of planting. It's going to be a lot of like stormwater, like green infrastructure type, low scale planting, if anything, not like trees. There might be some on the edges. I can't recall. But I do know they have published I can maybe look that up while we're talking if we go that long, or if we defer it, I can make sure to bring a parks rep next time.
I guess I'm feeling like probably this won't be the last time that we hear this case, so any information about that would be welcome. Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, it sounds like we're going to be deferring this case, so I wanted to just make sure we get a fulsome list of everything that we would like to see at the next meeting. It sounds like we have some technical changes right now in the conditions, also potentially a new condition related to the bike lanes. Is that right? And more information from the Parks Department about some of the plans there, including tree covering. Is that right? And I was going to see if we could get some additional information on the shadows, including the number of minutes, not just sort of the renderings, but just sort of how long something is going to be in a shadow to compare. And then I also had a question about the glare issues as well. And what our current rules we have now about the glare, and if there are any building materials or other requirements, if that is a concern of staff that could help alleviate some of those issues.
Well, I can answer. So there's the current regulations about glare all have to do with artificial lighting. So we talk about screening of, fixtures. There's no regulation about like how shiny your building can be or can't be. I'm sure there are materials that an architect could tell me are less reflective, but there's no rule in the UDO that requires anything of that sort. So.
Okay. I'm curious if the applicant has studied that issue and if we could address that. I know we have a hard stop at 6, so, I'm sorry, in 6 minutes at noon. So if you could bring back some of that information at the next meeting. I'll also have a question at that meeting about the environmental impacts with respect to the stream that you mentioned and the opportunity for cleanup, and whether that's required by site plan or if that's something that the applicant might be willing to consider as a condition. Any other items to bring back at the next meeting? Commissioner Dottel?
Well, yeah, just a reminder that I asked them to consider looking at potentially reducing the
Yes.
height towards the north side.
Looking at reducing height towards the north? Yes.
As well as just looking at that connectivity to the park condition to see if there's a way to refine that without locking them into something that's not feasible or possible.
Thank you. Any other items? Okay. Then without objection, we're going to hold that case at the table until our next regular Planning Commission meeting on November 8th. And there are 2 more items on the agenda, but I know we lose a quorum at exactly noon, so we will also be holding those 2 cases until our next meeting. I believe they will appear as old business, so they were at the top of the agenda. And So without objection, I'll hold case Z6822 and Z7122 at the table as well. And
Chair Miller, can I ask a quick
Yes.
question on that? Because it was mentioned that we've got a December 24th deadline on that case. Do we have 3 more meetings between now and Christmas? One in December, so it's just that second week in December that we don't have a meeting. Okay.
thank you. Okay. So then, wrapping up, that concludes all of the discussion items on our agenda for today. Next is the approval of the minutes. The draft meeting minutes from the October 11th, 2022 Planning Commission meeting are included in the backup. If any comments from the planning commissioners on those minutes? If there are no comments, I'd like to entertain a motion. Commissioner Elder? Commissioner Elder makes a motion to approve the minutes. Is there a second? Commissioner Dautel has seconded the motion. All those in favor? All those opposed? The motion passes 6-0. Next, moving on to the report of the chair. There is no report today. And moving on to the report of the members, I believe we have some other committee meetings this week. The first is the Infrastructure and Mobility meeting will be held this Thursday at its regular time and place, and at 3 o'clock. And the Committee of the Whole meeting will also occur on this Thursday, October 27th at 4 o'clock. Even though after that meeting, there are no more Committee of the Whole meetings listed on the agenda for the year, I believe that there is one tentatively scheduled for Thursday, November 17th. And we can address that at the Committee of the Whole meeting as well. But I know holiday plans are getting scheduled, so want to get that on your calendar. Any other reports from the Deputy Director? Or any other reports from the members, excuse me? Okay.
Just a reminder, I sent you an email. I will be out of town on Thursday.
Yes.
For
Thank
work.
you. You are excused. Report of the Deputy Director.
So one additional committee meeting to note, Strategic Planning Committee will meet on the 10th of November, and we've got one pending item, Wakefield Area Plan will be at that committee. You've also got the report in your backup that goes through all the cases that have been acted upon. I encourage you just to take a minute to look at that. We continue to move through a large number of cases, which is good. I was going to report that your next meeting seems fairly light, but we have changed that trajectory today. So it'll be a little bit more robust. And finally, I want to thank everyone for your time and attention last Friday at the retreat. I thought it was extremely positive. It was great conversation. Staff took away a lot from it. I hope you did as well. I would encourage you to be on the lookout in your email inbox today for the presentation. So I mentioned I was going to send that to everyone. You'll get a copy of that via email.
So I went back, speaking of the retreat, I went back through the staff reports before today's meeting. I don't see in there where the level of service is called out, because we talked about that and it was like, oh, that's in your backup, but I didn't see anywhere where it's in there. I mean, it gives the trip generation and all of that, but is the level of service in it? Did I just miss it again? Like current level of service is E or A? Because I looked through like...
If there's a TIA, I think the answer to that is yes.
Well, I even looked at Ramey Kemp's and I didn't see it in there, but again, maybe I'm just missing it. But just want to make sure.
Okay.
I think that'd be helpful, kind of as we talked about in the retreat. Make it a little bit more obvious.
Yeah.
Not just for us, but for the public, because I think that's an important piece
That's
of
a good
information.
comment.
Thank you. If there are no other comments, we are adjourned.